Welcome to Science for Hire with your host, Dr. Charles Handler. Science for Hire provides 30 minutes of enlightenment on best practices and news from the front lines of the employment testing universe.
Hello and welcome to the latest edition of Science for Hire. I am your host, Dr. Charles Handler, and I have a great guest today who is Bob Pulver of Cognitive Path IO. And Bob is an example of, I'm sure I've had somebody else on the show, but he's somebody that I've pretty much straight up met on LinkedIn just from seeing his posts and what he's doing and reached out. And, you know, there you start to see the value of LinkedIn for being able to share information and build some good connections, because Bob's got a really nice perspective on some stuff. You know, having been trained in or certified in the New York City law, I think we'll talk about that a good bit today. But the goal of the show is really to help create an understanding based on the view of a real professional and myself as well, who's focusing on these things. You know, in these uncertain times with all this stuff, what are some good takeaways or recommendations for folks who are interested in not only acquiring ethical AI products, but also providing them? So we'll have a good talk about that. And Bob, welcome, and please introduce yourself.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Charles. So my name is Bob Pulver, and I have an advisory practice called Cognitive Path, which is really focused on responsible AI within the talent, what I call the talent transformation or talent technology space. But certainly responsible AI, when we think about responsibility, certainly, as you just alluded to, Charles, I mean, this is about being responsible by design. So it's not just who's using it, but how are you acquiring the data, making sure that you're mitigating bias, from the beginning. And so there's a lot of, sort of upskilling, if you will, that needs to be done for everyone, regardless of what your role is. But it really starts at the inception of, your products and product ideas, and, where are we going to get data, from? Can we trust the source? And then testing it for, any, potential biases against, protected groups or, people with disabilities or whatever it is. And so I think a lot of it is really an extension of what we've already seen, right? Making sure that your products, your websites, et cetera, are accessible. And then the aspects of privacy, cybersecurity, and things like that come into play as well. So responsibility, when I say responsible AI, it's really the umbrella term that includes ethics, fairness, privacy, cybersecurity, and obviously, complying with laws and things like that. But it's really about mitigating risk, whether that's reputational risk, financial risk, regulatory, legal risk, and things like that. But we all have a role to play, and there's whatever role you're in, whether you're using this technology, which is soon going to be pretty much everybody, or you're building it, or anywhere in between. These are principles that you really need to be familiar with.
Yeah, for sure. And, one thing I feel like I know you have a really interesting background. I mean, a lot of folks on this show are either from the IO psych realm or from the talent acquisition realm, kind of through their whole career. I try to have a nice, mix of folks that don't have those backgrounds, because we need to learn from that too. But, and just kind of scanning that background, it seems like you spent a lot of time at IBM, doing some interesting stuff. So just kind of, tell us a little bit about your journey. How did you end up doing what you're doing now? Because it's not always something that people are going to just fall right into, right? It's kind of specialized.
Yeah, for sure. So, yeah, I was at IBM for over 20 years. So I did a lot of different jobs. I mean, it's one of the advantages of working for a big company like that. They're always doing interesting and innovative things. And obviously, just through my networks, through my experiences, and at the intersection of some of these, I guess some of the baseline sort of trends that led me in this direction, I got a taste for wearing those different hats and understanding perspectives of everyone from frontline employees. Like, I mean, my first job at IBM was doing essentially customer service before I got into projects related to software compliance, and being an early adopter and team lead as we deployed, definitely dating myself if I didn't already, but deploying Lotus Notes when IBM had just acquired Lotus in the mid 90s.
Yes.
And that was our first real exposure to anything that resembled sort of digital,
Yeah.
communication. But
That was a
most
big
of that
one.
IBM, yeah, for sure. And so I just got involved from there. I got involved in some SAP projects, modernizing, some of the supply chain. It's basically part of supply chain transformation, and then it was, process transformation. So I've done everything. I mean, I've done software testing, I've done software compliance, I've done market intelligence, I've done consulting, business analyst. I've been a chief of staff to senior leaders, so I've been in the room, even if I didn't have the title and the paycheck. I was, sort of a fly on the wall for a lot of, the discussions that related to professional development, that related to, leadership pipeline, and saw every angle of this. And then when I got to NBC, I really focused in the CIO's office of, how do we help them sort of modernize some of their legacy infrastructure. So moving to cloud, working with engineering teams, working with program and portfolio management teams, driving automation strategy. So a lot of these experiences at IBM, it was watching IBM Watson come out of the labs and seeing the impact that had. So I've gone through that first wave of, what we might call like predictive AI or analytical AI before this wave of generative AI. So I've seen a lot of the struggles that companies have when it comes to transformation, whether that's, business and process transformation or technology transformation, digital transformation. And so there's a lot of things that can go wrong. And really, it comes down to how do you enable change? How do you change people's behavior? How do you get them to think differently about how they approach technology and the impact that technology has on human beings? And so obviously there's some interplay with some of the user experience work that we're all doing. What is the future of the interface with AI, right? You
Yeah.
just have a verbal command, and then it goes and talks to all its other sort of sub agents and
Yeah.
other co-pilots that go and execute specific commands, so that you just have one interaction point for the user. But ultimately, the talent space really attracted me because I know what it's like. As I've just described, it was not a linear career by
Right.
any stretch. It was very
Good.
much, I use the word lattice
Yeah.
instead of,
Yeah.
but that has given me a lot of exposure to a lot of different areas, such that I can come into a problem and sort of anticipate and empathize with a lot of people wearing a lot of different hats. And so, like I said before, I mean, when we say responsible AI, it's really everyone's responsibility. So I think that helps me sort of align, some of the messaging and some of the potential, inhibitors or, roadblocks you might encounter as you drive this significant change. And I would say this AI driven transformation that a lot of organizations are going through now is, sort of the mother of all transformations, right?
Yeah.
Because
Oh my gosh.
no one is spared, I would say.
No. Well, let's go back. This might be a little aside, but it's something I really want to talk about. So you mentioned Lotus Notes. So I've heard there's still small corners of the world where that is still being used, but it was pretty much. I'm just going to admit it. I think I was in the workforce then, but I've never used Lotus Notes, and I'm not. I know it exists and kind of about it, but just tell us, and there may be younger listeners here who have no idea what it is, but just give me in a nutshell, what did that do? Is just a communication pathway between people and organizations?
Yeah, I mean, you could think of it as, before there was Microsoft, 365, before there was, Facebook and Yammer and some of the
Mm-hmm.
tools, even LinkedIn, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
Before there were these, sort of cloud-based, software as a service, applications. You did have network communication, but it was basically the first modern email platform that then
Right.
connected to calendar or whatever. So
Right. Right. Right.
if most organizations in say the late 90s were just starting to use like either Microsoft Outlook,
Yeah.
or we went with the Lotus suite, which was Lotus Notes, and then they had an instant messaging and web conferencing
Right.
tool called SameTime, which connected to it. So it was more than email because you could plug all these things into it. So imagine,
Right.
on your navigation pane wasn't just, a bunch of menu choices. It was, here's my instant message embedded. Here's my, single click to, sort of like browser extensions,
Yeah.
nowadays. Side panel you may have in Google where you can see your Zoom, single click to Zoom, single click to Google Maps and other utilities like that. So, but one of the things that was great about that was that it was like inside IBM, it was like a big sandbox, right? So
Right.
any developer could basically take the developer toolkit and create sort of their own, widgets and plugins that you could plug into the sidebar. So you join a meeting, you immediately see who's joined the meeting and what time zone they're in, and things like that. Or you can see who's online and who's away. So your full list of who's, if I need to go reach an expert, here's all my
Right.
people, here's all my contacts, and who's available right now. So you had a concept of presence, like a visual indicator of their presence and awareness, and it just helped to facilitate conversations. And you literally didn't have to leave your own sort of email client to
Right.
see who might be available for a quick chat or whatever. But honestly, it enabled me to be a remote employee, 20, almost 25 years ago. I was able to
Uh-huh.
be a remote employee because I had all those tools and that connectivity. Now, obviously, we didn't have broadband access, so most of it was audio only.
Yeah. Remember those days? Yeah.
Yeah. So very early days of broadband, and I know
Mm-hmm.
I was living in New York City at the time. I remember having a Roadrunner cable had
Oh
just
yeah.
been installed, right? But yeah, I mean, I think it was a precursor to a lot of the platforms and the design principles that were developed, after that. But certainly things got more complex.
Yeah. So, my reflection is and that was kind of ahead of its time. I was an Outlook guy just by virtue of what my company set me up with. That's why I didn't really have, much exposure in the early, I guess the late '90s, early 2000s. But the first time we come in touch with a technology that's didn't it's almost binary, like we just didn't have this before, we had no experience with it, all of a sudden we have it. My example is a little different, but I was starting, I guess, from the very first version. I had one of those T-Mobile sidekicks, right? So it had a QWERTY keyboard and you could do your email on it. So it was probably 2001 2002, and I just remember sitting at my friend's house watching football going, I could work from here. Like, I never had a BlackBerry because those were more corporate, right? But this was pretty much the same thing. It had a little app store, but they controlled that, so there was only a few lame apps on it. But it was the iPhone basically, but before that happened. And I just watched the documentary about the history of BlackBerry. I don't know if you've seen that, but it was pretty
I
cool.
I heard about it. I heard it was very good, and
Yeah.
I do intend to watch it. I haven't seen it
Yeah.
yet.
So they went head to head, to try to beat the iPhone, and lost, and the iPhone wasn't on the radar, and then boom, there it is. So, that's that was just, I couldn't even believe it. I felt like my whole life had changed because I don't have to be chained to my desk. I could be doing emails and I could be super responsive, which is a big thing for me, as I like to respond right away. And now I think generative AI gave me that same feeling in some sense, right? I still marvel, and I use it a lot, as a lot of us do, and I'm finding more ways to do it, and it's getting more integrated, more multimodal, all those fun things, which we can talk about in a minute. But that's how I feel still. I have this giddy feeling. And then, I break it down and learn about it, and I'm like, it's a prediction engine. It's all it is predicting the next word, the next token. But it just seems like, oh, how does it do that so fast? How does it know how to connect all these things and help all these people? And it's nuts. So we're living in a time where we've got another one of these first touch, experiences. And as they get more complicated, Lotus Notes probably didn't have a lot of ethical, considerations or whatever. But as it gets more intelligent and more just functional in terms of the things it can do, we begin to start having this baggage that comes with it, this
Yeah,
other reality, the other side of the other side of the coin, not corn. Let's kind of dig in then. So what are you doing these days? I mean, again, the goal here is people listening. I'd like them to kind of leave with the idea of, what is this responsible AI all about, and how can I help navigate through my company with it? And we won't have all the answers because the answers aren't available fully yet. But tell us a little bit about the kind of stuff you're doing now. I know were you a sponsor or a host of a pretty cool little symposium, I think, that happened, last week or 2 weeks ago in New York. And so that's one thing, but spend a little time getting us oriented to your world.
Yeah, yeah, happy to. So where I've been spending a lot of my time, as you sort of alluded to, Charles, in terms of what the audience wants to take away. I mean, I do spend a considerable amount of time sort of educating and evangelizing, responsible AI. I talk to vendors all the time to understand, are they thinking about this because it's in their best interest to think about responsible AI by design as they're developing solutions, if they're coming out with new products, new features that are, using AI or, algorithms to, come up with, scoring and, stack ranking and things like that, and advising them about the legislation that's coming. So you mentioned New York City. New York City has an anti-bias, legislation called Local Law 144. So if you are doing any hiring of potential employees who live in New York City, and that is the 5 boroughs of New York City,
Yeah,
Manhattan,
that's New York City,
plus
all of
800.
them.
And so if you have an office based there, headquarters is there, or you're hiring people who are New York City residents, and you are using a hiring tool that is considered an automated employment decision tool, or AEDT, then you are subject to this anti-bias legislation, which basically says you have to have an independent audit to make sure that there's no adverse impact against, basically checks for gender and ethnicity,
Yeah,
and
that's
whether
it.
there's adverse impact against either of those protected classes or the intersection of those two
Yeah,
classes. And so you've got to basically hire someone like me or you, Charles, or an AI software vendor who can do those kinds of engagements, or another audit firm. So I partner with a couple of those, but you've basically got to go in, and this took effect on July 5th of
yep,
2023. It's supposed to be an annual audit. You're supposed to, so by, July 4th, essentially, you're supposed to have this audit done, and then you would have the results of that audit made available publicly. And then you also have to, on your career page somewhere, give candidates essentially an alternative route to get their application reviewed if they object to the use of AI in the hiring process. So, yeah, the requirements are really to do the audit. This is an important clarifying point, Charles. The requirement is to do the audit. Whether that audit shows adverse impact or not is actually not the point of
I
the
know.
legislation. The point of the
Yeah,
legislation is to literally do the audit, which is a little weird, right? I mean,
it
if I
is
told my
weird.
daughter, I don't need you to study for this test because you don't have to pass or fail. You just have to take the test, and you only get in trouble if you don't take the test.
And you don't have to do any remedial work really. If the test, if you fail, you don't have to come back and study again and take it again. Really, it's the whole thing's fascinating. I mean, I've talked to a lot of people about it. I've studied it. I've written about it. It's interesting. One of the things, though, there's not a lot of precedent, right? But the most interesting thing about it, and there's a lot of places folks can learn about it in depth. But if we start thinking about the application of it for end users, people who are hiring, it sure doesn't look to me, from the sources I've seen. I think you might have shared that the GitHub link to, was that you, that has kind of a posting of some of the ones that have been done. And in my experience, I've talked to a lot of companies about it as an advisor. Nobody seems to actually be doing, like, I would wager that there is a truckload of companies that have hiring happening in New York who are not looking at this or doing these yearly audits yet, and kind of waiting to see what's going to happen, which I feel like is really interesting. It's not really striking fear in the hearts of people very much, I think. And
Yeah.
this is an isolated thing. This is one thing. But this kind of stuff's going to start happening globally, and I don't think people are going to be able to ignore it as much. But it's an interesting
Yeah.
phenomenon. Why do you think? What's your experience been like? Why do you think companies who definitely need to be doing this are just saying, yeah, you know what, not right now. you know?
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting situation. I think there are multiple reasons, I think. One is even the legal HR and legal teams at these organizations, if we assume for the moment that they're well aware of this situation, they are not exactly sure how enforceable it is. Because I think
Yeah.
there's, and I mentioned this on the panel I was on last week at the AI for Talent virtual event, and I was fortunate to be on a panel with Keith Sonderling, the EEOC commissioner, among other very bright panelists. So he and I have talked a couple times about this, but it just seems like the language in even the final legislation is not 100% clear, because the categorically a piece of technology isn't necessarily by itself categorized as an AEDT,
Yeah.
yes or no. It also depends on how you use it and the weight
Yep.
that its output carries in your decision.
Absolutely.
And so you can imagine there's between the ambiguity of the language and the subjectivity where of the target, the client, that could always say, well, we combined, this, score, or the results of this, algorithm with, five other things, plus our own team's, human judgment, who is New York City to say that this had, material weight in
Yeah.
the decision. So the language, I think, says, like, if it significantly influences or makes a decision.
Yeah, which we've kind of taken as 51% of the decision or something like that. But that is the hardest part of all of it, right? Because it's kind of binary. Do you qualify or not? And I advise folks on this all the time. I mean, it doesn't have to be an AI based tool. There's a thing in there about how the algorithm works. And I think that the intention was, if it's kind of an automated, self updating, algorithm that you don't have full control of. But the reality is that the actual criteria are simply like, is a human involved? Can a human override it? And is it a substantial part of the decision? So you could have a plain old, multiple choice test that's as old as the Stone Age, but you have a cut score, and if you don't pass that score, at high volume, nobody ever sees it. You just get dispositioned out. Well, in my mind, that's an AEDT, and in my mind, you have to, comply. I don't know that everybody sees it that way. The AI part of it is clearly what's driven this, because of the unpalatability. But what advice then? And there's really two factors as well. It seems like the people, in my experience, that are more concerned are the vendors who are selling these tools and who want some kind of an audit done. Keep in mind, everybody, I'm sure you would echo this, but there's no mandate that the vendor at this point have any kind of audit. So there's kind of this preemptive, let's provide this document to our prospects and clients so they can feel good about the fact that we're doing the right thing, but it doesn't satisfy any kind of New York City audit. So that's one flavor. But let's focus on, how would you advise? Like, give us a little bit of a snapshot of, I'm a multinational corporation. I'm global, but I have offices in New York. I contact you. I've had some of these conversations too, but I'm curious how they go for you. And they say, look, we're hiring in New York. We don't know how to comply with this law. And in general, what other laws are happening that we need to be aware of? We need some input, because we don't know here. And you're probably talking to legal, and other folks too. So give us a quick sketch of, how do people fly in, and what's your process a little bit with this?
I think it really depends on where, what sort of triggered the conversation. So, I guess there's different starting points depending on who the client is and where we're coming from, because as I said, responsible AI is broader than complying with any particular piece of legislation within a jurisdiction, whether it's a major municipality like New York City, or it's an entire continent, like not full continent, but a region and collection of countries like the EU, which is they're finalizing legislation around the EU AI Act, which builds upon a lot of human rights legislation, data privacy, GDPR, and things like that. So really, what I want anyone to think about, whether it's a vendor building AI powered solutions, it doesn't even have to be full blown AI. To your point, Charles, it could be any algorithm that's or autonomous process that's coming up with some kind of score or rank that allows a human to essentially filter out a set of candidates. And so that's one of the things that I have people thinking about. Like, you're going to be playing whack-a-mole if you try to keep up with these things one at a time and keep up with even the patchwork of legislation that's coming across the United States, right? So New York City, it's hiring and promotions as it relates to local law 144, but Illinois or Colorado may have something related to facial recognition with video interviewing, or even going beyond HR use cases. I mean, you've got facial recognition, or if you think about more regulated industries in financial services, discrimination and potential bias in loans from a bank, or a life insurance policy, or charging people higher rates based on historical data that has nothing to do with your own driving behavior or your own health and wellness or whatever it is, right? So what I try to do is narrow my scope within things that not only affect people, but people and their livelihoods and their employment, which is why I spend most of my time with HR vendors and talent acquisition teams at these clients. The vendors, to your point before about the vendors, they're not on the hook for New York City, and that's partly because, as we talked about, part of this is who is impacted, where's the adverse impact, and who is impacted, and so how it's used affects that adverse impact. But the vendors should definitely not consider themselves off the hook, because places like EU are going to hold them accountable for the algorithms that they've built, right? And so when it comes to complying with the EU AI Act, or maybe whatever the UK comes up with, and there's legislation perpetuating around the globe. There's stuff in South America and Latin America and Southeast Asia. So the guidance that I typically give is you need to be paying attention to the legislation that's coming, and basically move to where you're being where you're mitigating the most risk, and where you're building systems that comply with the strictest guidelines. It's almost like finding sort of the common denominator over all these pieces of independent legislation. Because if you can comply with the EU AI Act, for example, you're probably going to comply with most other legislation. But the tricky part is, how do you keep track? How do you try to anticipate all this? There's obviously, some of these legislative documents and proposed bills are incredibly, detailed and long. I mean, you actually have to, you either need a big team, or you actually have to use some of these AI tools to summarize, the key points, or you follow, some of the influential, voices who keep up with it. Charles, I know you've put out some document with frequently asked questions around New York City. One of my AI governance platform partners, FairNow.ai, has put out a bunch of resources, and they try to keep up. We've read this, we've read this all and interrogated it, so you don't have to kind of approach, which is great. But yeah, I mean, I think eventually we'll see this just sort of embedded as a normal course of business, just like we've seen with data privacy and cybersecurity. I mean, you wouldn't do business with people that you knew, or you didn't think your data was going to be secure, your password wasn't secure, and things like that. So eventually, I think this is going to be one of these must-haves. So the vendors, they should think about it not just with in terms of complying with any particular legislation or who's on the hook, but they have a responsibility to build tools that use data that is trustworthy and build algorithms that are trustworthy and can be audited at any time. And just like you would for before you move to production, you check it against privacy and cyber and all these other check boxes. I think this just becomes another one of those things. It may even be that we've got a new sort of onboarding, annual compliance training module that goes into all kinds of things around basically an extension of bias and other types of discriminatory
Yeah.
training for employees so that they understand we have a weakest link kind of situation here where anybody that misuses an AI tool could expose the company. But you've got to think about your reputation. You've got to think about doing the right thing, of course, and you've got to think about that customers are going to start to get more and more informed, and they're going to start asking you these questions in their RFI and RFP process. All else being equal, wouldn't
Yeah.
you rather go with a vendor, even if it was a little bit more expensive or implementation was going to take a little bit longer or whatever? Wouldn't you rather know that your vendor is truly a trusted data source and a trusted partner in the responsible AI sort of context?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think without that, the vendors are going to be in trouble.
Yeah, it's a much broader, right? I think the thing is we tend to focus on what's the glaring thing that we're all talking about, which, would be New York City here in the US, but it's a much broader look than that. And I think if you're flying in at that narrow look, you're missing the bigger picture. I'm starting to think, and I'm sure this is already happening, that companies are going to need an AI compliance officer just sitting in the a CAI CO or something like that. I'm sure they'll come up with something like that that's really responsible for that house within the organization. And we're probably seeing some of that. And there's every vertical that touches it. It could be supply chain or outside of HR, let's say marketing, sales, whatever it is. There's all these same governance things that are happening, right? The hiring has been flagged by the EU, justifiably so, as a high risk use case, right? It has a direct impact on people's lives. One thing as an aside, though, I made a note here. The Illinois law's been around for a while, and you never hear jack about it. Like nobody said anything. It's a whole state. There's a lot of people getting hired, especially like Chicago's probably not exactly as big as New York City, but people didn't talk about it. It's been around since 2019 or something. And, I've never had one person inquire to me about it. Maybe it's more narrow because it's automated, interviews with I don't know for sure if it's just face recognition, but at any rate, I mean, what gives with that? Why don't people care about that? I like Chicago just as much as I like New York.
I think it's getting pulled into when people talk about the sort of patchwork of legislation. I think it's getting pulled in. So I mean, we see this a lot when people are trying to either prove their point or demonstrate the scope of where we've got some challenges. So I think depending on the context, people are pulling in legislation that relates to any type of discriminatory practice, even if it's not the cleanest line to connect them all. But you're right. I mean, some of that technology predates a lot of this current wave of concern and legislation. But I think I was not sure how I felt about OpenAI just releasing ChatGPT to the world. There was a part of me that thought that just knowing how long it takes for people to embrace and adopt technology, having gone through that wave of automation technology research and putting a business case together at NBC Universal, I've already seen this, I guess, potentially contentious situation where people are worried about job displacement. And if you start taking it's a slippery slope, just like people push back on any legislation that might take away any rights whatsoever, because they think it's just a bellwether of what's to come. Well, if they take this away, then they're going to take next
Right.
time they're going to take this away, and then all of a sudden our rights are taken away. So I think people are starting to, think more deeply about that. And so I guess one of the benefits of them releasing this to the world is that it woke everyone up to
Yes.
what's possible and the risks.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think in that sense, it was good, but now unfortunately we have to sort of play catch up, and legislation may never keep up, probably never will keep up with advancements in technology. I mean, that's been the situation for the dawn of time, right?
Huh. What be interesting if ChatGTP starts writing its own legislation, right? Oh, hey, write me some legislation. But it is, I just was reading, it's the fastest adopted technology, globally. I mean, maybe that's because it doesn't cost anything. And, even for $20 a month, which
Yeah.
I marvel when people kind of waver on whether to spend $20 a month on this thing, because it's, you get a lot for your money there. And it's interesting just policy wise. Like, I'm doing a series of interviews right now for a project of IO psychologists overseeing assessment programs at global companies, and kind of asking, as part of that, what do you have policies about ChatGTP or not? And there's a wide range. Some companies will still let people use it. Some buy their own copy where they can control it a little bit more. Some completely ban it and people use it anyway. I mean, I think that's going to be like many other drugs and things, because I almost think about it like that. I'm addicted to it, right? People are going to use it anyway. They might have their own computer they're using it on, but may help. But anyway, I mean, and that's a whole nother millions of conversations, but and it may factor into this, but I'm going to kind of bring up, but what's your typical use? I'm more interested almost on the consumer side. Is it really just kind of breaking down what a company is doing now and helping identify the risk that they have, and maybe how to mitigate that risk? Is that commonly the type of thing that companies think about, and why they would need someone like yourself or me?
Yeah, I think that for adoption to take off, I think people are going to have to be people. When I say people, I mean both individuals and organizations are going to have to get more comfortable and set some parameters. So the analog I think of social media, the advent
Yeah,
of social
right.
media, and everyone said, "Oh, whoa, 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 whoa. Like, no, we're gonna put the brakes on this. I don't know anything about this. I don't know where that data is going. You should not be going on to Facebook, or at the time it's probably
Yeah, I was gonna say
MySpace or
MySpace,
Friendster or
Friendster.
something
There
like
you
that.
go. There's
But
one from the
yeah,
past.
but like, and like I think Twitter
Mm-hmm.
was blocked in a lot of places. I forget if LinkedIn was lumped in with them or not. But point is, organizations had to institute like some guidelines, right? These are at IBM. We basically looked at it like there was a set of business conduct guidelines, expecting you to behave like an adult and not discriminate and just be a good IBMer. And then when social media came out, people came up with what they called the social computing guidelines.
Yeah.
So this is how we're going to trust you, right? We're going to trust that you're going to behave like an adult.
Huh.
We're
Good luck
trusting
with
you
that.
that you are not going to disclose anything. If you work in research or M&A or whatever, in product development, you should know this already, but don't even think about sharing any proprietary information. But otherwise, have at it. Help us, grow. And this was the start of, brand
Mm-hmm.
ambassador, you know,
Exactly.
programs and
Critical
influencers who,
stuff. Critical stuff.
yeah. So really, really important stuff. And, it turned out that, this wasn't just a B2C thing. This was like, or a C2C thing. This had a lot of value for
Yeah.
B2B. And so, social marketing and, social, that's when I went into market intelligence actually. And I was focused purely on social insights. So looking at all the conversations and helping brands understand that their customers are talking about them, whether they like it or not. And you don't have to be part of the conversation, and this is happening and it's public, and you can either ignore it or you can join the conversation and try to guide people to learn more about all the great things that you guys are doing and building and whatever. So I see it analogous to that in a sense that you can't. They're going to use it. They're already using it, whether you've sanctioned it or not. You have to treat them like adults. But trust is a two-way street. So when some people say that they're fearful of AI, well, let's unpack that, right? Are you fearful of what AI can do in general? Are you fearful of how your company is going to use it to, replace you or monitor you, or not give you that promotion, or not give you the pay equity that you deserve, or there's all kinds of things that you need to understand. And so organizations need to communicate very clearly what their expectations are, and to have some level of transparency so that exactly how your company is using AI in all across people, process, and technology, so that what the impacts are, and so that you are sort of aligned with the organization and your team in terms of the value that AI can bring, while still understanding this may mean some adjustments for you, as more things get taken off your plate and automated, which we all
Yeah.
hope for. Well, what does that mean? Are there things does my job role change? And if so, does that mean I have to, upskill and learn some new things? And if so, are you going to support that? So how are you investing in your workforce, not just by investing in the technology itself, but how do you retain and keep your employee base engaged, such that you still have this, mutually beneficial relationship? Because otherwise, things start to break down, right? So a lot of my conversations are around, what does this mean? How are we using it? Let's make sure we're experimenting, but aligned to specific use cases, and understand the ramifications to any people that are impacted by that, whether you're on the team, or you're a customer of that solution, or what it is. But we really need to think deeply and broadly about the implications. So one of the things that the nonprofit called For Humanity that issued me my certification, and it wasn't just here's how to audit New York. It was, here are the foundations. There's a foundational sort of course and certification that talks about, what does it mean to be an independent auditor?
Yeah.
What are AI, algorithmic, and autonomous systems, and how do I do this, and how do I coach organizations about how to set this up? So you can try to sort of incorporate this into some other cross-functional groups that might be sort of pre-existing. But really, as you alluded to before, Charles, this AI piece and all the ethics and governance and everything that goes around that, it really warrants a dedicated role, and some specific communities focused on AI ethics, AI risks. And that needs to be, this isn't just top level people. It's people that have the knowledge and understanding across lines of business, across disciplines, so that you've got the cognitive diversity, and you have what For Humanity calls multi-stakeholder input for all these. Because without those diverse perspectives, especially if you're a global company, you need to really understand some of the ethical considerations, some of the fairness considerations that people in different cultures and different countries and regions think about. And so without bringing all of that to the table to make sure that you're using AI in a constructive and fair way, then again things can fall apart, and you've got a weak link in your chain there.
Right.
But
Right. Hmm.
yeah, I think there's a lot for people to be concerned about, but there's definitely some practical things that they can do to stay on top of it. And it's not just the technical.
Right.
This is not just for the CIO to worry about, or the
Yeah.
CTO to worry about. It, your data officer. It's everyone's involved,
Yeah.
right? Head of communications, head of marketing. I mean, everybody's got to be aligned and aware of what this all means, and they've got to be sort of singing to the same
Yeah.
tune. So that's part of my objective, not just as an independent advisor, but I'm just launching a partnership with HR.com to build a learning community around all of these topics that I think are critical to move the ball forward, and make sure we're all thinking about these types of things before we start building or
Yeah,
using
it's
this.
it's philosophical as much as it is empirical, right? I mean, and the philosophical part is what leads you to the empirical part, because if you're not philosophically interested in this stuff, you might not use it. And then if you're not philosophically interested in the safety aspect of it, you might ignore that. And it's becoming, a really critical thing. As far as the certification goes, I mean, that's pretty interesting. I first found out that existed from you, but have had two, maybe three different instances where people not from the US have contacted me to talk about the New York law and compliance, and they said, well, we have to find a certified auditor. I'm like, that's absolutely not a requirement. I think I might have even checked with you about it. There's no such thing in the requirement, and I didn't even know there was such a thing. So it's cool to hear that. Is it fair now? No, it's that's uh, for
For
humanity.
Humanity is the gave me the
Yeah.
certification. I mean, there's other certifications. I think even they have a partnership with one of these AI
Uh huh.
audit and advisory firms called Babel.
Yeah, I've heard of Babel before. Yeah.
I mean, they offer a program. I don't know if they offer some kind of training to do it. So you're right. It doesn't. There's no requirement for a certification because there's no certification
Yeah.
standard. But I liked the approach that For Humanity was taking, just because they took a more comprehensive view than just what the law provides, but they do keep up and get accredited for their curriculum by the different governing bodies so that you can get
Right.
certified. So I have my New York City one. I can also get one in GDPR. I'll be able to get one in EU AI
Right.
Act, so that even if I'm not acting as an auditor, which I can do when I provide pre-audit sort of advisory services to do an assessment of where how they would fare if they did go through a formal audit. I know that I'm checking the right criteria, and some of those platforms like FairNow would allow you to basically take the same data set and algorithms
Right.
and outcomes and check it against a variety of different legislation, so they keep up with that so that you
Yeah.
don't have to. And as new legislation passes, they can just add that to their platform. So you can do it, and just to make sure you're passing the audit, you could just do it on an annual basis, or again,
Yeah.
these
It-
vendors allow you to install it as well as a SaaS solution and do continuous monitoring. Because one of the things about this is, your algorithms might change as they learn, ingest more data and
they
learn, and whether that's done
typically will, right?
sometimes that's done at the vendor as they push new releases. They may release update to the algorithm, and then you may have concept drift, and the new model may create adverse impact where there wasn't before. So that's why you got to continue. The vendors should be continually checking against this kind of criteria, and that's why this isn't a one and done kind of thing for clients necessarily, because some of these solutions you can not fine tune, but people familiar with like ATSs, where you can go, or maybe a better example is like an AI powered sourcing solution, which may not be an AEDT, but it's still telling you who to go
Yeah.
try to reach out
Bigger
to. And
problem
so
in
it
my
comes
mind
back.
than the other stuff.
Yeah, like each recruiter might be able to fine tune it and say, show me more like this and
Yeah.
less like this. Well, now
Recommendation
you have
engines,
to,
they call that, right?
might have looked like a simple thing, but you just made an adjustment to the algorithm. So
Totally. You just biased it based on your input when it may not have been biased to begin with. So that's pretty significant. So it seems to me like I would give the advice to either side, vendor side or the consumer side, that maybe they should start having internal people certified on these things as well, so they can really be up on what the requirements are, as an internal advocate, advisor, team member. I think that seems to be something that, one would like to think about. One thing you did, which you just opened up, which in the few minutes we have left, we can't get into too much, but I think it's important for people to think about. I think probably the biggest Satan in all this stuff is what you talked about, the who sees a job ad, the algorithms that do that, the algorithms that will allow a recruiter or someone to say thumbs up, thumbs down, and then train the algorithm to do that, which could perpetuate bias. Neither one of these things fall within the actual funnel of the proper hiring process. Yet, from a pure statistical probability standpoint, if you're not putting plaid marbles in the top. You're not getting plaid marbles out the bottom at the ratio that you want. And that is a big problem, and a lot harder to check because it's just out there, and people may not even know where to look for that kind of stuff. So that will be an interesting frontier within hiring. We've got it locked down at least to here's a process, here's a workflow, here's a beginning, here's an end, and it's got some brackets around it that you can box it. But as you go more free range, you lose that, and it probably gets even harder. So at least we're focusing now on a small part of it that's important. It's more within the individual's control. Who's holding the titans of the industry who show job ads responsible? Who knows? They should be holding themselves responsible, but who knows what their algorithms even know, what's going on.
No, I guess that's where I want to go. It's important for people to understand New York City, legislation. So that's important because, you are showing, where there might be some adverse impact, but you're right. One side of the argument for all the tools that are used in the hiring process before a candidate actually applies are not going to be considered under, in scope for a law like New York City, the way it's defined. But and some might say, well, no one's, who's being harmed, by some of these tools earlier in the process. Well, I guess that's where I try to go further than any particular legislation and be responsible, because like you said, somebody's using an AI powered, sourcing tool, or even like programmatic advertising. There's algorithms behind all of these things. And so if you're, there's a global talent pool and opportunity, it's the opportunity that's not, evenly, distributed, even though great talent exists everywhere. So if you're not casting as wide a net as you should or as you could because of that algorithm, then you've already sort of, in some ways, tainted the talent pool or skewed the talent pool. And so you're only sourcing people that, fit a certain, mold, or you've inadvertently, circumvented or not notified, or not done outreach to people who might be in one of those protected classes. So it's sort of this hidden, it's like hidden bias that doesn't have an immediate, affected, party or class, but it still comes to responsible, AI practices. I would want people in building those solutions to think about these things.
100%. And everything that comes, the fruit of the poison tree, in some sense, if you go to the legal doctrine. Well, so my takeaway, and we got to wrap it up here, is you got to think broadly. Even if you're worried about one thing, this has got to be a holistic thing where you look across the board, you think forward, not just tactically in one situation. The bigger strategy can help you deal with the local situations better, but this is not just a little fly in the ointment. This is really our new reality. It's going to get, and we're just in the infancy of it, right? So we're going to see hopefully some things level out and some good. I think we're going to see some bad too. I think that it's inherent in the nature of what we're dealing with here, that there's going to be good and bad operators and people who accidentally use things wrongly, and people who try their hardest to use it right and still don't get it right. So it's an ongoing thing. People like yourself are super important to a lot of folks right now, including job seekers and people who are on the other end of this stuff. So I really appreciate it. Let everybody know, what's the best way to follow you, get in touch with you. I know I always say, like, I should just say, find this guy on LinkedIn every show, but there's probably other stuff you're doing. So close us out here with a quick promo.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it, Charles. No, this has been a great conversation. My email is bob@cognitivepath.io. You can go to cognitivepath.io and check out my website with different service offerings that I can provide. And I would say LinkedIn is easy. I think I'm the only Bob Pulver on LinkedIn. And the other thing is, this just to promote quickly the community that I'm launching with HR.com. So if you go to AIX, as as in AI Exchange, AIXonHR.com. You'll see we've got a landing page there. We're going to be kicking off. We'll have a press release shortly, but we're going to be kicking this off with a pavilion at HR West, which is a conference coming up the first week of March
cool.
in Oakland, California. So we're going to have a half-day sort of summit there with some very informative sessions and a keynote speaker, and it's going to be a lot of AI experts and folks there. So, but it's going to be an online community that kicks off from there. So it'll be leveraging some of the HR.com resources and some of the community that sort of pre-exists there. But it's really a place where people across HR and beyond can learn more about responsible AI-driven transformation, and what this all means for skills hiring for skills and potential.
Awesome. Congrats on that.
There's a lot.
Yeah. Well, they've got a lot of visibility and a lot of content for many years. I know Debbie pretty well, so they're good stuff. So thank you very much. Appreciate your time today and all the good wisdom that you shared with us.
Absolutely. Glad to be here, Charles.
As we wind down today's episode, dear listeners, I want to remind you to check out our website, rockethire.com, and learn more about our latest line of business, which is auditing and advising on AI-based hiring tools and talent assessment tools. Take a look at the site. There's a really awesome FAQs document around New York City Local Law 144 that should answer all your questions about that complex and untested piece of legislation. And guess what? There's going to be more to come, so check us out. We're here to help.